reserved by the gentleman from North Dakota.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee report for the resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment just to walk through it briefly. This goes to the issue of the distinctions between the case against Mr. Biden and the case against Mr. Trump. There have been multiple allegations today about, from the Republican side, that somehow the Department of Justice gave favorable treatment to President Biden. But I wanted to offer this amendment to make sure the record is clear, and also to make sure not just that the record of the discussion today is clear, but also that the report that ends up being sent forward, and I think is going to be the lead document if this gets to court, and again, I hope it does. But I think it balances out the one-sidedness, or helps to start and move it in that direction of the report that the committee has floated, the Republicans have floated. There are, on this point, Special Counsel Herr, who testified here and said this in the report as well. Several material distinctions between Mr. Trump's case and Mr. Biden's are clear. There are serious aggravating facts in the Trump case, most notably after being given multiple chances to return classified documents to avoid prosecution. Mr. Trump allegedly did the opposite. According to the indictment, he not only refused to return the documents for many months, but he also obstructed justice by enlisting others to destroy evidence and then lie about it. In contrast, Mr. Biden turned in classified documents to the National Archives and the Department of Justice, consented to the search of multiple locations, including his homes, sat for a voluntary interview, and in other ways cooperated with this investigation. And the final point here, I think, is that unlike the deliberative acts of former President Trump to retain and conceal classified materials from the federal government, Special Counsel Herr found likely inadvertence and or mistake. And so we go on to quote some of the language from his report as well. We find the evidence as a whole insufficient to meet the government's burden of proving that Mr. Biden willfully retained the Afghanistan documents in the Virginia home in 2017. For other recovered classified documents, the decision to decline criminal charges was straightforward. The evidence suggests that Mr. Biden did not willfully retain these documents and that they could plausibly have been brought to these locations by mistake. Unlike President Biden, Donald Trump intentionally and flagrantly took and concealed highly classified documents. Mr. Trump's actions are extremely serious and warranted the 32 counts of willful retention of the documents as he was charged. I want to say this as well, and I think I mentioned this earlier. Former Vice President Pence faced a similar factual scenario. There were documents found in, I believe, in one of his residences. Unlike Mr. Trump, Mr. Pence turned them over. He cooperated immediately. There was no evidence of any type of an effort to try and obstruct the investigation, hide the documents, or anything like that. Certainly didn't ask anybody to move the documents for him, as Mr. Trump, I think this was raised in the indictment, had done. So I ask that this be included for the point of completeness. We want to make sure we send a document. I would oppose the whole thing, as I've stated repeatedly today, but if you're going to forward this document, at least send a document that has some semblance of balance to it, and I think shows the effort to try and present the court with a full take on information with respect to this particular issue. And as I mentioned earlier, this wasn't a place I was expecting to need to go today. I thought we were going to be focusing more on the specifics of, especially the executive privilege issue after it was asserted by the White House. There's been almost no discussion on the legal merits of that from the Republican side. And I guess with good reason. They don't seem to have a strong argument to address it. But since you brought this up, since you brought up the Trump contrast with Mr. Biden and sort of coupled it not only with allegations of misconduct by the overall Department of Justice, but specifically Mr. Herr, who I don't necessarily agree with everything he wrote, but I certainly am not going to sit here and essentially slander him for, trying to be unfair, tilting the system, trying to cover up for the president. None of that is merited, and I don't think there was anything about the report or his testimony that he presented here that would support that. So, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Strike through Ross, we're in opposition to the amendment, but it almost passively aggressively proves the point. This wasn't substantially similar to Vice President Pence. It wasn't substantially similar to Donald Trump. We have a 40-year history of keeping classified documents, 40 years. It's why the audio is important. He's reading classified documents to his ghostwriter, reading them to him. Like the dismissal, this isn't I've worked with the DOJ in an adversarial way, and you know what I've never seen for a regular defendant in criminal court? The DOJ making the plausibility defense over a 40-year history. And we talk about disingenuous and all of those things. If you spent 40 years robbing liquor stores and then you cooperated with law enforcement, they're not going to charge you. That is a sentencing factor. That's an obstruction factor. That is a different factor. If you're going to the underlying offense of maintaining and disclosing classified documents, that is a significantly different thing. And only in this world would you go to that place where we'll say, hey, you committed the underlying crime, and you did it for 40 years, but you cooperated with us, so we're going to allow you to skate. That's the difference. You spend a lot of time talking about the obstruction charge, but we don't spend enough time talking about the egregious nature of the underlying maintaining and disclosing classified documents. Like, that's the difference. And that's the problem. And that's why audio matters, because the audio matters, and there's inflection and there's different ways in which you do it. I mean, if you're telling your ghostwriter in a laughing matter that you are reading classified documents to him as he's writing your book, that's different than a lot of different ways in which you do it. And the transcript is all of that. But there is no other scenario. And by the way, I would have gotten into this with Special Counsel Prosecutor Herr, but we have the 5-minute rule, and I had a lot of other things to get out. But you can talk about the secondary part of this case all day long, but I don't think anybody who reads the report, looks at the nature. He did it when he was a senator. He did it over 45 years. He had been warned about it and continued to do it. You have to seriously jump through some hoops to get to the inadvertent part of it. And so you're talking about maintaining and disclosing classified documents. And if anybody thinks that the information in the Herr report doesn't give a valid reason for that occurred knowingly and willingly, then the question is, why wasn't it knowingly and willingly? And that's where we're at this point. So
Would the gentleman
talk about obstruction. I'm going to yield to the gentleman, Mr. Benz.
Thank you. Just a question. If I recall correctly, when I asked Mr. Herr if his report exonerated the president, his answer was unequivocally no. Is this consistent with your thought?
Well, and absolutely, and we've heard that over the course of this whole thing. There is no claim of innocence. There is no finding of innocence. That is not how reports work. But we keep going past the underlying offense, which is the classified documents offense. And why wouldn't you cooperate? Why wouldn't you cooperate when you have the ability and knowing exactly how everything works through and where the differences lie? Yes.
Yes. So thank you for the yield. It just seems to me that Mr. Herr was saying we don't exonerate. What we're going to do is say that the president is an older gentleman who is incompetent, and we don't think we can get a conviction. Therefore, we're not going to prosecute. But to that point, I want to ask you as a federal prosecutor.
Oh no, as a defense attorney.
The best evidence rule. You can talk about that just for a moment, because I know it goes both ways lots of times. But is there any doubt in the world that the best evidence of what we're trying to get at here is the verbal recording?
There's a reason for the last 5 years in Congress, I have worked with my friends on both sides of the aisle to get to custodial interrogations being recorded by federal law enforcement. Take it completely out of this room and this political thing. And to be honest, oftentimes I fight with my side of the aisle on that issue more than I fight with your side of the aisle. The reason you want audio, the reason you want video, the reason you want those things is because it is without a doubt the best evidence that exists in which to overall deal with the issues that you're trying to incorporate. And if you want to talk about legislative purpose, as somebody who has been watching this happen from the minority and the majority for 5 years, there is the equal application of justice part of this answer. We have a guy that was prosecuted a year after he altered an affidavit in front of a court, and he's currently practicing law in Washington, D.C. right now. And so with that, I see my time has expired, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The young lady from Vermont's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Thank you. I just want to run through some of the statements that were just made a moment ago. I guess I can work my way backwards to some extent. With respect to the recording of statements, and I share the gentleman's view about the importance of the federal investigators recording statements, but I would make a couple of notes to that. The first is, for example, there are no videotapes of grand jury testimony. For example, they're all electronically transcribed by court reporters in the room. And nobody would argue, that I'm aware of, that that's not evidence sufficient for use in court, for use to charge for criminal purposes, for example, for false statements or perjury,
Would the
or
gentleman yield?
impeachment. I will.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, because in that scenario, it's the best evidence.
Yeah, it's certainly sufficient for the basis for criminal charges. And with respect to scenarios where you have a transcript and a videotape, if the videotape, you can use the tape or the transcript for impeachment purposes or whatever. I mean, it's sufficient. So the point here, I think, though, given the nature of the proceeding, it's incumbent on you all to show that there's some additional evidence that you can get from a videotape that you can't get from the transcript. Yeah, you may have given me the funny look, but that's what's going to be required. If this goes to court, we would have to justify a finding of contempt, because the burden would be on this committee to show contempt, right? So what's the difference between the transcript and the tape? And you've talked about the lapses in time, and I just questioned a moment ago. I don't know how that gets you from, it's a 5-second pause, it's a 15-second pause. I don't know how that gets you from a statement to that's therefore impeachable or chargeable or anything along those lines, which is what's required. In the legislative purpose standard, I haven't heard a reason for how it's not satisfied by the verbatim transcript, which you've already been presented with. And there's no question about it being verbatim and accurate based on what Mr. Herr said and based on the certification that this received at the time that it was recorded and printed. You mind if I yield to the gentleman from California?
I don't.
I yield to the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Ivey. And I think the point is, it's never going to be enough. Like, you guys are not doing oversight, you're doing overkill. And as soon as you get the audio, you're going to say, well, we wish there should have been a video. And then you'll get a video. And then you'll say, well, we wanted his health records. Like, well, who knows, like, if he, wasn't on some medication that affected it. And then once you get that, you're going to say, well, there was not a polygrapher there. We don't know if he was telling the truth or not. You have been thoroughly, and I want to emphasize, thoroughly humiliated in your impeachment quest, which, by the way, is that happening? Is that dead? I pronounced it dead a couple weeks ago. Is it happening? I don't think it's happening. And so you're humiliated. And so you're digging and digging and digging and digging, and you just want more. But guys, it's not happening. You're not impeaching him. You have nothing. I just invite you to move on. Like, let's do something that actually helps people. Just move on. And we're never going to make you happy because you just don't accept him as president. And so we're wasting everyone's time by doing this exercise. And I yield back.
Would you yield for a minute?
I yield to Mr. Cohen.
Thank you. Mr. Ivey, I very much like Governor Armstrong, and I'm happy to work with him. Well, he's still been here, but he won't be here soon. But this whole thing was about whether or not the president, when he was the vice president, violated the law. Mr. Herr said he definitely took these documents. There was no question about that. But he couldn't get a conviction because he was a sympathetic character. So what good is it going to do if they get to hear him say he was a sympathetic character, and why they thought that? That's not the issue. The issue is, did he take the stuff or not? Her said he took it. There's no question about it. He took the stuff, and for his biographer. And Jordan says motive and blah, 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 and indictment. It's about the fact he's a sympathetic character, and you couldn't get a conviction. That's the issue. So we're off on rabbit trails. You should never get off on rabbit trails.
And just to sort of make a final statement here, the amendment I'm offering doesn't actually go to that. It just goes to the fact, the distinctions that Herb drew between Biden and Trump with respect to the mishandling of documents and the obstruction of justice that occurred afterwards. So I would hope that we can get a vote on the merits from my colleagues on the Republican side on that amendment.
Gentleman yields back, or gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivey?
Aye.
Mr. Ivey votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Aye. Ms. Ballant votes aye.
Chairman, am I recorded? Ranking member?
Mr. Nadler, you're not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye.
Gentleman from Virginia?
Mr. Klein votes no.
Gentleman from Texas?
Mr. Gooden votes no.
Gentleman from Kentucky?
Mr. Massey votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 8 ayes and 9 noes.
The amendment is not agreed on. Who seeks recognition?